So I feel the need to start any Q&A right now, seeing as how we're doing this via video conference with the question of how are you?
这个现在我在北京，然后也是刚刚从我的家乡回来。从这个2月份中国爆发疫情到现在，前一个部分呢，就是和很多人一样都在家里面，就是保持社交距离，没有办法离开家，主要是写剧本，然后也拍了一部短片。关于疫情的，那后来旅行被允许可以旅行之后，我就回了我的故乡，在我电影一直游到海水变蓝的所拍摄的这个村庄里一直住到上个星期刚刚回到北京，一切都在恢复正常，还好。
So right now I'm in Beijing and I just actually returned from my hometown and last week. And like everybody else, since the beginning of pandemic in February, I have been very much quarantined at home. And during that time, I have been writing script. I made a documentary with the theme of the corona pandemic. After the travel restriction was lifted, I decided to start to travel back from to my hometown. And I have been staying there since until last week that I decided to return back to Beijing, and that's where I am now. And everything is fine. We're just trying to make do whatever the experience, the environment that we're in.
Well, I mean, even in just that description of how things have been for the last few months, you're moving between the rural village and the city and the way that the film does, and then the way that the authors that we're tracking throughout the film seem to have. And one thing I really wanted to ask you about is to follow up on something that you mentioned in the introduction about the need to return to rural China, to the village, to tell the story of modernization, which is something you've done in your career before. But can you tell us more about this particular project and the literary aspect of it, which does feel novel?
因为整个中国社会那个人口一直非常多，那么这个过去那个中国主要的人口都生活在农村，农村是中国最主要的社会形态，城市很小，可能在过去只有像上海、北京称得上是城市。那么农村的生活，它形成了我们的伦理，形成了我们的生命经验，看待这个世界的方法，形成了我们人和人相处的一些办法。那么这个改革开放以后，从70年代末开始，经济开始发展，那么特别是最近10几年，中国剧烈的城市运动、城市变化，大量的人口离开了农村，他们进入到城市生活。那农村发生很大的变化，就是人们很多城市的人口第二代更年轻一代城市的这个居民，其实他们的父母都是来自农村，他们的生活也受到了长期的农村生活的影响，但是我们对于自己身上这种文化基因是不了解的，所以在这样的一个背景里面，我觉得要了解今天中国的困惑，了解我们个人的困境，了解我们很多在城市里发生的无法解释的问题，需要回到我们过去的生活的过程，比如说我们曾经经历了什么，这些经历对人有什么样的影响。比如说整个影片的第一个部分就叫做吃饭，在今天中国吃饭已经不是一个问题，但是在30年前、40年前，它可能还是困扰每个人的一个问题。那这几十年也是解决吃饭问题的一个过程。那么就是这样的一个问题，它对我们的行为，对我们理解这个世界的方法产生了什么样的影响，我们是不知道的。但是当我们回过头来看，获得这个农村生活的经验，去了解它的时候，可能我们会理解很多发生在现在的情况。
So for Chinese society, it has been rooted very much in the rural areas and the modes of production, agricultural productions. And the mass populations actually live for generations in this particular context. And in terms of urban cities such as Shanghai, such as Beijing, they weren't the mainstream cultures because the vast areas in China is very much the rural areas, and also populations are very much living and reside in these rural areas rather than the urban cities. So I do think that after the massive and dramatic transformation in the 1980s, have this, in terms of the economic powers of China that they have experienced in the past decades, I do see that there's a massive migrations of the rural populations into the urban cities. And this type of urbanization created a very interesting dynamic between generations. A lot of second generation children that they actually were born in the urban areas or urban environments, whereas their parents are actually from the rural areas and rural environments. And that kind of generation gap to really create certain conflict among these people, because very much so the parents' generation, so the older generation, they're very much informed and informed by the ethics, the values, the ways of living, the ways of creating interpersonal connections and relationships in those rural settings and rural cultures. So that I think the root of the conflicts and the difficulties and the problems that we're experiencing now have a lot to do with that kind of generation gap or that kind of misunderstanding or lack of understanding of where we came from, which is the experience and the environment that we were in way before the urbanizations. And that's the reason why I want to somehow focus on not only spatially what happened in the rural areas and the changes among these years, but also temporally how things have changed throughout the years. For example, the first chapter called Eating, this is very much at the root of a lot of problems, difficulties, the parent generations in the 30s and 40s that they experienced. And in the past 30 and 40 years that the problems that the country has experienced in terms of hunger, in terms of poverty. So I do think that in order for us to understand the rituals of how we eat now and how things have changed and find out the experience in the past, we need to look back on how people ate or not being able to eat 40 years ago through the recollections of these authors talking about what the eating experience was like back then.
You know, that explains a lot. I'm thinking back just to the fact that we, from the early scene of the kind of older villagers eating, we immediately start the story of Ma Feng arriving at the village and talking about irrigation and talking about cultivation. And from there, the entire story of the film seeming to blossom out of this story of how the village's circumstances were changed by mutual aid groups working together to figure out a way to improve the situation of food, and then moving on from there. It hadn't really, I mean, it is pretty direct. It's like a very clear starting point for the film in a way that seems obvious now, but has really gotten me thinking about that, actually. I wanted to ask you, I wanted to pick up on that point about the intergenerational tensions, because it really interested me, for example, in the chapter on journeys, the young couple sharing headphones, the noises of phones and technology, in contrast to these rural histories that we're hearing. Can you talk a little bit more about when you talk about the problems between generations? Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because that was a tension that I very much felt as I was watching.
一直到海水变蓝，从人物上，它是由中国的4代作家4个世代来构成的。马芬活跃在50、60年代，那么这个第2位人物贾平凹是50年代出生的，第3位作家余华是60年代出生的，第4位作家梁鸿是70年代出生的。他们出生在不同的时代，他们 产生写作的冲动啊，就是他们对于生活的观察是来自于不同的时代。那么整个影片呢，实际上我们也能观察几代中国人他们都在做些什么，都面临的问题是什么。我觉得还是有一个很大的改变。如果说马峰那一代他们选择了集体化，选择了用集体化的方法来对抗饥饿，对抗这个贫穷的话，那么到余华这一代就开始回归到个人化，他们更加强调个人的权利、个人的意识啊，一直到梁鸿的儿子最后一位人物，虽然他不是一位作家，他是梁鸿的儿子，但是他已经完全到了一个新的时代。那么这个新的时代，我觉得它最大的区别，可能除了刚才讲到的这个科技在塑造它、政治在塑造它之外，我觉得内在的一个改变，实际上就是有一种群体的生活、群体的意识，逐渐的又回归到个人的意识。我觉得这个变化还是挺明晰的，在这部影片中。
So I intentionally selected 4 authors to recount their memories and their stories and their experience. And these are 4 authors from 4 different generations. For the first author, Ma Feng, he was the most prolific in the 40s and 50s in terms of his literary work. Whereas Jia Pingwa, the second author, he was born in the 1950s. The third author, Yu Hua, he was born in the 1960s. And the fourth author, Liang Hong, she was born in the 1970s. So for me, it is interesting to see how these different 4 generations of authors that had different impetus, different motivations to write what they're writing about throughout their careers as an author. And I do think that you can see very clear distinctions going from, for example, Jia Pingwa or Ma Feng's generation, that when they deal with the issues of hungers or poverties and all the other social issues, it's very much in this collectivizations, that kind of collectivism concept, and to somehow find solutions or somehow depict what it was like back then in their stories. Whereas when the story moved to Yu Hua, you can see that how that particular era is very much about leaving the collectivizations or the collectivism behind, really trying to seek out or strive for that sense of individualism, that kind of individual identity, about individual rights, about individual freedoms, and all the way to the Liang Hong's, in this case, actually the son of Liang Hong, the 4th author. You can really see that the effects of modernization, urbanization, and how that have impacted this particular generation. So I do think that it is not so much so about just the technologies in terms of how the headphones or the iPads that you're using. Of course, that's part of the progress that we can see from the outside in terms of exterior. I do think that more importantly is what's the changes and transformation in terms of within, including the ideologies from the collectivism all the way to individualism and other ways that people start to think about and value things very differently as a result of these transformations.
And as someone born at the latter end of the spectrum that you're talking about in 1970, I believe, I'm curious because these tensions and these changes are things that reappear, I feel, in your work. Something that I really value about your work is that you are mapping out this cultural shift and the ways that personal lives and spiritual lives are inseparable from these broader changes. So I'm wondering, I mean, just as someone born in the latter end of that, what is it like to be looking backwards in this way? It seems very, very important to your work that you are able to look backwards, and it seems important that this story is rooted in a place that's personal to you.
实际上我觉得它跟就是当我们在中国的社会现实中生活的时候，我们经历过很迅速的变革， 比如说我本人70年代末产生的变革是我所经历的，那么这种变革它带来的这种改变很明晰，但是另外一方面呢，就是我们可能如果往一个更长的时间角度去观察的话，这种改变它是一直在发生的，有的时候会缓慢，有的时候它会剧烈。但是不管是缓慢还是剧烈，甚至有的时候你会感觉停止，会感觉静止不动。但实际上，如果在一个比较长的时间去观察中国社会，它一直在改变，而这个改变它是由不同世代的人一代接一代的人在推动。这让我想起一个中国的著名的一个古代的故事，就是愚公移山的故事。就是它从某种程度上就是也是对于我们来说感受到内在的这种变革的力量是重要的，特别是在今年这样的一个氛围里面，我相信就是这种前进的推动的力量，它还是一直占主流、占主导的。我希望呈现揭示这种事实。
The reality I experienced in the 1970s is very much my own personal understanding of the dramatic transformations that we have experienced as a society. And I do think that even though it is clear to me what changes that we have made, but at the same time, in order for us to understand what actually goes on within the Chinese society, we need to put it in a long time span. And only in this particular context, we can understand that there's one thing that is constant, which is changes. And I want to somehow tease out this concept that the changes that we experience might be clear to us, but sometimes if put it in a historic context, you will realize that sometimes these changes come slowly, sometimes these changes, they come suddenly, and sometimes you just hit that stagnation period that there are no changes at all. But no matter what, changes are constant. And in order for us to somehow move forward, we need to somehow still have that understanding that even though that certain changes might come slowly, but the society is changing, and we need to almost as if evoking that particular very famous Chinese stories of someone who was just moving one rock at a time, trying to move the whole mountains. And that is exactly what I'm trying to present with this particular documentary. It's to tease out that the changes in different generations, while they might be different in terms of its speed and its scale, but we are changing. And we also want to somehow continue these changes, no matter what we are somehow discouraged at times, but these changes are coming and changes are necessary for us.
I'm interested in specifically, with all of that in mind, the focus here on literary figures. Part of what strikes me is that they, to a person, all very beautifully, I think, describe and elaborate on exactly these ideas. I'm curious about your relationship to the changing literary landscape and the ways that literature's purpose and role in reflecting and taking account of these changes. I'm curious about your curiosity about that, because it is very, you integrate excerpts from many works, you give us that great sense of the literary festival and people's voices overlapping. And we hear, just even to your point about intergenerational differences, we hear even within that moment of just literary festival, so many overlapping but distinct accounts of the ways that even that village had changed. So I'm just curious about literature's role here, because I think it's very pointed and part of, for me, what was very moving.
文学的变化，也是跟中国社会的变化一样，也是充满了，也是非常的剧烈，就是写作的形态的改变写作类型的改变，就是过去可能我们的文学在 80年代之前是不够个人化的，就像影片第一个部分他们所讲到的，大部分是集体生活，那时候的创作也有很多是集体意识的反映。那么80年代之后，所谓思想解冻，从贾平凹他们开始的改变，就是带来了个人的书写，从一种集体意识的书写到一个个人经验、个人记忆的书写，这是中国文学在这几十年里面最大的一个变化。那么到最近几年，更年轻一代的作家，他们从个人的书写到了私人的书写，更加的私密化，他们跟性别有关，跟个人隐秘的世界有关，它更加回归到一个个体的经验里面，这个变化反映在文学里面也是非常突出的。你像从这个马峰他写集体经验、集体生活，到梁鸿他写的是个体的隐秘的私人记忆，他讲他的母亲、他的姐姐，他写他的家庭生活，他是用非虚构写作的方法来写自己私人的经验啊。那我觉得在这里面，这个文学的变化是显而易见的。
The changes in the literary landscape very much reflect what's going on in the society in terms of the dramatic transformation we have experienced as a country. And one particular ways that you can observe changes is through the genres of writings of these past decades. And before the 1980s, especially during Ma Feng's eras, you can see that the writings is very much about collectivism. It's about the collective mentalities and cultures and ways of being. Whereas after 1980s, through the writings of Jia Pingwa and later authors, you can see that it's very much about individualization, individualism, and the stories that they are telling and they are recounting is very much from the personal memories perspective. And I do think that as it evolves, that kind of transformation from collectivism to individualism further somehow changed into the contemporary authors. They tend to go from the individualistic personal memories to very, very private memories of their own. So it's not just personal, it's actually very intimate, very private information that they're sharing. And this is very much about either the identity issues, whether or not it's about the most private aspects of their lives and their beings that they are sharing with the readers through their works. For example, Liang Hong's work is very much about the not only personal memory but also private details of her own life, and it's in the nonfiction genre. So I do think that you do see how the literary landscape changes along with the overall backdrop of the transformation in the society.
Curious. I mean, something that I feel when I watch every one of your films is I just walk away overwhelmed by the vastness of the scope of your films, and I mean that in terms of both where the stories go, but also the number and the range and the types of questions that you ask in every film. And I'm just wondering how that happens in a way. I'm wondering, because this feels, I mean, it feels, I think, uniquely special to your work that one can walk away with such an abundance of an abundant sense of the worlds that you're depicting, and in a 2-hour runtime, you seem to do far more than most people do in much more time. So just as you're approaching these stories, I'm just so curious, or organizing, for example, a nonfiction material into a documentary. How do you get a handle on the scope of these things as you're making them? Because it truly is, I just think it's unparalleled for me.
我想可能这种努力是跟我目前生活的感受有关的，因为我经历了这种从没有互联网到有互联网，逐渐的我们生活在一个信息特别多，可以说是充满了碎片化的信息包围的这样的一个 这样的一个环境里面，那么每天得到非常多的信息，它致使我觉得存在一种信息的迷雾，它让我对自己的身世有一种片段式的呈现我生活被片段化了，我自己的记忆甚至经验也是片段化的，那我觉得如果说我去了解我们的社会，了解我们的生活的演变过程，它是一个人的身世，是一个人的这个身世之谜的话，我觉得这个谜团对我越来越重。那么在这样的一个碎片化的氛围里面，它迫使我开始需要沿着时间的线索去了解我的身世。这个身世就是包括我们这个社会经历了什么，它就是所以致使我最近几部影片都没有放在一个短的时间里面去讲述这个故事，去描述一件事情，而是都放在了一个比较长的时间线索里。因为我觉得在这样的一个情况里面，获得一种整体性，获得一种历史的角度，去理解自我是很重要的。它可以说是我的一个需要。
I think it's come out of necessity as a filmmaker. I do think that right now, my life experience, and it's very much informed by the environment and the technology that I am in. I lived through pre-internet era all the way to the internet era. And I do think that after internet becomes such a ubiquitous technology, it somehow created this particular environment that is overloaded with information, and also the information we are receiving have been very much fragmented. And that actually have a huge impact on how I live and my experience, my memories. Somehow I feel that I am puzzled by my own experience, by my own memory, just because of the fragmentation and also the overload of information I'm receiving now. So in order for me to somehow unpuzzle the situation, not only as a society, but also for me as a human being and my own upbringing, my own background, I think that it will require us to somehow stay away from that type of fragmented way of thinking about time. And that's why I rely on the long span of temporal elements and journeys in many of my works in order for me to somehow take a look of what really happened and what is my true experience, my own true memory, or our society as a whole, our national memory and national experience in a more holistic and more historical way, so that we will have a clear picture of what we actually experience and who we really are as human beings.
It's interesting to hear you say that about fragmentation, given the occasion of this conversation is a film broken up into 18, I think, parts. And yet what you're saying really resonates, that this film, for its many sections, doesn't feel fragmented. To me, it feels sort of unified in some ways in terms of the echoes that I hear between stories of authors who grew up at separate moments, but seem to, in many ways sort of draw upon and recount similar, or no, let me backtrack that, not similar, but who seem to recount a cohesive, I think, sense of the rural changes and the literary changes and the spiritual changes. So that makes me curious about the decision to divide this movie up into these smaller segments and to have so much going on, music with shots of labor, with the integration of poetry and all of these things. A movie that, by all accounts, should feel fragmented does not for me. And I'm curious about that tension.
实际上一开始这部纪录片我在构思的时候，它的结构主要是按时间来构筑的，也就是说不同世代的4代人，他们的经历必然是带来了中国一个线性的从40年代到今天的一个生活记忆，因为背后有公共的记忆，比如说 都经历过60年代、70年代、80年代，是按这样一个年代排列的。但是影片拍完之后，我觉得我在众多的碎片化的信息里面，因为每个人的讲述其实也都是碎片化的，当我们去整理这些讲述，寻找他们内在的情感逻辑的时候，会发现就是实际上这个一代一代的中国人都在解决一些基本的问题，这些基本的问题每个问题不一样，但是有一个共同的，它是人生存基本要面临的问题，比如说吃饭、恋爱、自由恋爱的问题，比如说病，比如说出生，比如说这些问题，它让这部影片，即使这些人私人的问题、私人的记忆，它也实际上是人类共同的经验，就是在私人的经验里，我看到了人类共同的经验。在碎片化的这个不同角度的问题里面，我看到了它的公共性。这个公共性就是我们所要面临的问题和解决的问题。它甚至可能会伴随人类一直有。在不同的阶段，我们要解决不同的问题。那么从这个角度来看，它们又形成了一个整体，就是谈这个世界的困难和人的对策。
So the original concept of this film, when we first started, I was going to somehow structure the film in a chronological order, very much so it's following the 4 generations of authors in a very linear way to somehow put together not only the collective memories that they have from the 60s, 70s to the 80s, but also their personal and individual memories during that time. And of course, these memories and these recollections can be very, very fragmented. As I was collecting these fragmented recollections of what happened, experienced by these 4 generations of authors, I suddenly realized that there are also certain emotional logics that I can somehow structure this particular film with. And the emotional logics are the ones that I think everyone can relate to, because these are the basic problems and issues that we all need to deal with as human beings. So on the humanity level, I do think that because of the private memory, the individual memories that they have recounted very much mirrors those universal problems that we all share on the humanity level, such as eating, such as love, such as disease, such as birth. So I thought that it might actually be beneficial for me to not only structure everything chronologically in a linear sense, but also somehow find that type of emotional logics that is universal for us to all contemplate about, that these indeed are the same exact issues and common problems that we need to face as a human being. And somehow, because of that particular angle, we can all see this as our own experience as well, and also find solutions to solve this as a whole on the humanity level.
Well, I want to thank you for speaking with me. I found this movie really, like so much of your work, overwhelming, and it just made me, as someone who has not lived these experiences, think about how I would recount my own experiences in relationship to history. Of course, we're living in a moment right now where it is easy to sort of think about where you fit in the scheme of things. But thank you. This has been a great conversation.